I want to read a comment from viewer Kristen Lee, who writes, "There are too many lucrative salaries on the line that depend on that $1 trillion a year military budget to allow Russia to end up being boogeyman number one, uh, to not end up to have Russia not end up being boogeyman number one, I believe. They are fighting for their own lifestyles." And I think that speaks to a broader point that the Russiagate narrative is one that sustains privilege because really, who does it threaten? I mean, yes, it threatens Trump, but we already know that there's a huge cross section of the elite that despises Trump, including many Republicans who campaigned against him during the campaign. And of course, Russia has no huge, powerful lobby in Washington. Russia has no major economic power in the U.S. So attacking Russia really hurts nobody domestically in a position of privilege and influence. And meanwhile, attacking Russia serves a double benefit of allowing people then to deflect from other interests, much more powerful than Russia, that are doing real damage here at home, as Paul has been talking about.
Could
Paul,
I
let me
just
ask you about
could I just
Paul. Let me
add
ask you about. But let me ask you about China first, because
okay,
we're
before we
talking.
do China, let me just add one thing to
Sure.
this, which I think, while the importance of the existential threat of Russia, the importance of that narrative to the military-industrial complex, I think that's only one piece of why the American state and large sections of the American oligarchy see Russia, I don't so much as a threat. They keep using the word adversary. And the reason why, I think, is there's several pieces to it. And I said this in the interview the other day. One, the United States does not like regional powers that are not under the American thumb. They don't want anyone. The United States wants what they call in some of their documents full spectrum dominance. They want global hegemony. Global hegemony means hegemony in every region of the world. They do not like it when any power emerges that challenges for regional hegemony, because that's obviously part of global hegemony. So they don't like the fact that Russia has a major economy, not one of the biggest economies by any means, but a major economy, a big army, of course, nuclear weapons. So they don't like that it has such, kind of independent will in this region. It's not a global competitor. But there's another piece. There's another piece to this. Russia has oil. They don't like an oil state, a country that has such massive oil supply, not being under the U.S. umbrella, U.S. hegemony. That's number two. Number three, they don't like the way Putin and that state emerged. If people are watching the series that I'm doing of interviews with Alexander Buzgalin, we're telling the whole story of the emergence of Putin out of the collapsed Soviet state, Soviet system. In the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a free-for-all plundering of all the natural resources and state resources, privatization mania. And the Americans thought they'd get a much bigger piece of this. I don't think they thought, after all these years of bringing down the Soviet Union, in truth, the Soviet Union fell mostly for internal reasons. And bureaucrats within the party and the state became the oligarchs, became the billionaires. They seized a lot of these assets, not the West and the Americans. And out of the chaos emerges a Russian state led by Putin to create some sense of normalcy, turn it into kind of a normal capitalist country with laws to some extent, so you can do business and commerce. And one of the things that state did is it didn't allow the West to just hocus pocus, I forget the term. They didn't just allow the West to come in and pick up all these resources and privatization directly themselves. So this Putin state's been to some extent blocking the U.S. from turning this Russia, as they have with most other areas of the world. Of course, the other big exception is China and then Iran, into the American global capitalist system, where the Americans are the dominant power. And they even had ways to do that, but these things don't always jive, I should say, which is the economic incorporation of Russia into global capitalism, into like even into the EU, for example, or some structure like that, does not jive with the narrative that of an existential threat that serves this massive military expenditure. So different parts of the state, U.S. state, have different agendas connected to different sections of capital that have their other agendas. But none of this justifies this McCarthyite level of Cold War rhetoric.
Right. So, in terms of China, as we're talking about other possible explanations for Trump's desire to work with Russia that go beyond him being a potential intelligence asset, or that Putin has compromat on Trump, which really is right now the dominant corporate media narrative and question. You've been laying out some. I want to focus on China for a second and actually read to you, Paul, a quote. This is John Pomfret. He's a historian, and he writes about Kissinger talking to Nixon after Kissinger returned from China as part of the Nixon administration's overture to China in the early 70s. And Kissinger observed to Nixon, he says, "In 20 years, your successor, if he's as wise as you, will wind up leaning towards the Russians against the Chinese." And then he went on to say, "Right now, we need the Chinese to correct the Russians and to discipline the Russians." So I found that interesting because, A, it's a way to help understand what might have motivated Nixon's overture to China back then. But also, I think it might help us understand what might motivate Trump's overture to Russia now. Obviously, China has been a huge obsession of Trump's. He talks about it constantly. He's launching a trade war right now. And it's quite likely, I think, he recognizes that if he really wants to confront China, a far bigger world power than Russia is, especially obviously economically, then he might need to enlist Russia for that task.
I certainly think there's part of it, how conscious Trump himself is of these kind of geostrategic assessments and plans. I don't know. Trump's a very smart con man. I don't know that he has a big geopolitical brain. But that being said, he's got people around him, including John Bolton, who are actually quite smart and have real geopolitical brains and are fanatics. My guess is the short-term play, and I don't see this. I think it's ridiculous that Trump is a Putin stooge and all this. The agenda of this group that's in power and that Trump represents the interests of, this isn't just a one-man band, even if he flies off at the handle in a one-man way. But this agenda of Iran and China, was very well articulated by Steve Bannon before and after the victory of Trump in the election. Excuse me. This has economic interest, which of course, China is the real economic competitor in the world that's a threat to American dominance. But it also has an ideological framing for it, and that's the defense of Western Christian civilization. And I think they believe in this stuff. Bannon himself is connected to Opus Dei in the Catholic Church. He's connected to Cardinal Burke. They're waging a war against Pope Francis. They want to overthrow the Pope, and it's really as open as that. They're shocked that they got a Pope that's a social democrat. The metaphysical vision of the world, and don't forget, Hitler had quite a metaphysical vision of the world. The role of the mission of the Aryan nation to take over the world and march into a new era of civilization and all this was all intertwined with a metaphysical, quasi-fanatical religious view of the world. Well, I think they have this. So China does not fit the plan of saving Western civilization, but Russia does. And Putin is very close to the Russian Orthodox Church. He's been promoting this kind of nationalism intertwined with the religious messaging through the church. He promotes this kind of stuff in Western Europe. Putin has been nurturing the far right in Western Europe. And so this jives. The agenda of the people around Trump and Putin have similar views of the world. And it is a far right view of the world. So yeah, the idea of some kind of accommodation with Russia because of the coming trade war and who knows what kind of war with China, yeah, this is definitely, I think, part of the equation. The shorter term play is Iran. This group, this cabal in Washington is fixated on regime change in Iran. I'm actually not sure why they see that fits the China strategy, but I don't know that it matters because that's their play. And they've been talking about it for years, since the late 1990s and this document, Project for New American Century. Undoing the Iranian Revolution has been absolutely at the core of these people's foreign policy. So all these things are interconnected, and dividing Russia from China and having clearly some kind of alliance there, it's also in the interests of Putin, but it's very much in the interests of this cabal. I think we should even stop talking and being so focused on Trump, because if they bring down Trump the individual, they'll find some other individual to come play a similar role, and whoever he or she is, won't be such a clown.